Hi, John the Occ Doc here. Welcome to another Occ Doc Talk. Today's video is on how to complete Federal OPM 2009 version of Optional Form 178, formerly SF78. Many U.S. government employees must undergo a medical exam prior to beginning work. It is not really a pre-employment physical, it's really a fitness for duty exam, as it is only performed after a job offer has been given. Office of Personnel Management, that's OPM, uses Optional Form 178, or OF 178, to document the results of that exam. Despite the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980, and despite many doctors finding it surprising that all but the most unusual people have 8 pages of body parts that can be examined without surgery, the OF 178 is 8 pages long. The first page consists only of instructions for which all of us may be grateful. They point out that the form has 5 sections, identified remarkably as parts A, B, C, D, and E. So far, so good. Those are not as uninteresting as they may seem, as we're about to learn. Box 5 of Part A on page 2 is to be completed by the new employee and requires him or her to know what has been written in Part B on page 3. How the information in Part B came to be on page 3 instead of page 2 is a mystery and is the subject of a forthcoming children's bedtime story. In what might be a eureka moment for physicians, the instructions in Box 5 require the prospective employee to, quote, explain fully to the physician, unquote, any interfering, quote, medical disorder or physical impairment, unquote. This surely is patient education at its finest. The physician can be completely ignorant of any pertinent medical condition and simply depend on the patient explaining it completely. This could account for why many medical students are so eager to perform these exams. Why study liver disease if the patient is responsible to explain it fully to the doctor? Box 3 of Part B, quote, brief description of what the position requires the employee to do, unquote, takes up almost 7 vertical inches of page. Some apprehension at this point is common, as those faced with completing the form get an inkling of what the form's designers consider to be paperwork reduction and brief. There is also a remarkable statement found at the bottom of each page that reads, for local reproduction only. Depending on how a person understands that statement and whether he has concerns about overpopulation may affect the forever faithful form filler's level of anxiety. Box 4, found on page 4, still Part B, lists the various functional requirements of the job. Theoretically, this is extremely useful information for the medical examiner and will be the basis of the exam and the determination of medical qualification for safely performing the job. Unfortunately, in an effort to leave nothing to chance, some personnel appointing officers check every box. This can be a source of some consternation for the hapless physician, especially when a newborn intensive care unit nurse appears to require heavy lifting, working on ladders, working with explosives, and working alone. Other personnel appointing officers take the opposite approach and leave everything to chance and to the doctor and leave Box 4 completely blank. The physician is left wondering if the examinee will have no job duties at all, or if he or she is applying as an alternate for the VeggieTales Pirates Who Don't Do Anything trio. At this point, if parts A or B or both are not completed or are inconsistent or appear to be inaccurate, the medical examiner should proceed no further. Part A may be completed or straightened out by discussing discrepancies or omissions directly with the examinee. However, if Part B is incompletely or improperly completed, the physician should return the form to personnel, as Part B information constitutes the only valid basis for the exam. Now, I realize this may be met with great distress and commotion at personnel, along with claims of abuse and dire warnings of imminent catastrophe, possibly of cosmic proportions. Hang in there. Do not let personnel foist its duties onto the physician. Physician foisting is a time-honored tradition of personnel departments everywhere. Their real job is to adequately describe the new employee's job. The physician's role is to determine whether the worker is medically qualified to safely perform that job. The sooner the physician refuses to exceed his sphere of operation, the sooner personnel will begin providing the physician with essential information. Part C on page 5 is the section for the physician to complete. It begins with this statement, quote, The person you are about to examine will have to cope with the functional requirements and environmental factors checked in Part 4 of this form. Please take these and the brief description of the job duties into consideration as you make your examination and report your findings and conclusions." Unquote. This may simply be an error, or it may be a devious attempt by the form designer to get the doctor to flip pages and frantically search his desk and even the floor, all in a fruitless effort to find Part 4. As previously mentioned, the OF 178 is divided into sections labeled parts, and those go from A to E. There is no Part 4. Ha ha! However, there is a Box 4 in Part B. I will assume the instructions to the physician pertain to that, having wasted enough time searching my desk and floor. To emphasize a previously made point, if Part B states that the nurse caring for newborns is required to be able to do heavy lifting, the examiner must disqualify every nursing candidate that cannot do that, regardless of whether the physician is certain that the nurse would do a fine job of caring for teeny-weeny babies or even whoppers topping 10 pounds. For reasons unknown to modern man, paragraph D of Box 2 of Part C mentions Jaeger No. 2 type and includes a box stating what the president may do. I am fairly confident that the president is unlikely to read that box, or any part of OF 178 for that matter, unless one of his children is applying for a government job. If the person before you is the president's child, I suggest you move slowly and deliberately during the entire encounter, keeping both hands visible to the Secret Service at all times. Getting back to Jaeger No. 2 type. That is a near vision test and is equivalent to 20/27 on the Snellen eye chart, which is the one most Americans are familiar with. Jaeger is named, by the way, after Eduard Jaeger Ritter von Jachthal, a 19th century Austrian ophthalmologist, and one wonders if his parents had a cruel sense of humor and a worse sense of spelling, as evidenced by the names they gave their children. Eduard's father, however, cannot really be blamed, as his own father was named Beer. Continuing on with the OF 178, Section E of Part C on page 5 includes the question everyone wants to know: can applicant pass lantern test? This is referring to the Farnsworth lantern test, not to some camping maneuver learned in the Boy Scouts. The Farnsworth lantern test is also known as the Phalant. This was designed by the U.S. Navy solely to identify those who could not distinguish red and green and thus were unsuitable to navigate at sea. The Phalant does not test for blue deficiency, presumably because if sailors could get the red and green buoy signals right, it wouldn't be too hard to figure out that the large wet thing the ship was floating on was the deep blue sea, which, after all, is blue. To complete Box 3 of Part C, the patient should cover one ear at a time and have his or her back to the doctor, and the doctor should speak in a normal conversational tone and volume. The greatest distance in feet at which the patient can understand the doctor is recorded. If the patient's hearing is so poor that there is no response when the examiner is right behind the patient, the examiner should be considerate enough to carefully tap the patient on the shoulder, lest the patient spend the night facing the corner of the exam room waiting to hear further instructions from the doctor. Item A of Box 4, Part C is, quote, eyes, ears, nose, and throat, including tooth and oral hygiene. This should be taken to mean teeth hygiene, unless the patient is from West Virginia, like the person who designed this line of the form obviously was. Do not be unsettled by Item C of Box 4, head and back, including face, hair, and scalp. Although that gives the impression that face, hair, and scalp are part of the back and not of the head, the doctor should not expect to be examining some space fiend or alien. Likewise, Item G, skin and lymph nodes, including thyroid gland, should not be taken as referring to non-human anatomy. After many attempts, I can confidently advise you not to waste time examining the skin and lymph nodes for signs of the thyroid gland. Just examine the thyroid as usual and comment if an abnormality is found. Part D is, quote, to be completed by agency medical officer if one is available. I am not sure what happens if an agency medical officer is not available. Regardless, Box 1 of Part D is the box of most interest to the agency that sent the person for the exam. It is also what the physician should be most circumspect about completing. The choices of Box 1 are recommendations to hire or retain with or without limitations, or to separate or not hire. The physician should not make any such recommendation. The physician is making a medical determination of fitness for duty. That determination can be summarized by statements indicating the presence or absence of medical conditions that would allow, limit, or prohibit the examinee from safely performing his or her job. However, personnel will want one of those two boxes checked no matter what the physician says. Here is what the doctor can do. If the examinee is medically qualified, check the first box, cross out the text, and write in, quote, "No disqualifying medical condition found," and list any limitations. If the examinee is not medically qualified, check the second box, cross out the text, and write in, "Not medically qualified," or something similar. If further information is necessary to make a determination, check the second box, cross out the text, and write in, "Further information required to establish medical qualification," or write in, "Information currently available is insufficient to establish medical qualification." Do not list tests or procedures you think are necessary. Do not order additional tests. You may write something like, "Documentation establishing that the examinee does not have a disqualifying condition required," or even "Documentation establishing that the examinee can work on ladders or scaffolds at height required." Do not order consultations unless the job specifically requires such an evaluation. The physician completes the rest of Part D, then gives only pages 7 and 8 to the examinee with a pre-addressed envelope marked "Confidential Medical." Note that the instructions in the upper left corner of each page could lead the unwary and weary doctor to include the whole kit and caboodle. However, only put pages 7 and 8 in the envelope and do not take the red pill. Otherwise, the personnel office will have personal, private medical information in their possession, and you will be eating watery oatmeal from then on. If medical conditions are found that should be investigated further, the examinee should be told and should be directed to see his or her personal physician. If there is a disqualifying condition, the examinee should be informed that documentation will be required that establishes that a suspected disqualifying condition does not exist. For example, that a skin lesion in a radiation worker is not cancerous, or that an existing disqualifying condition is controlled enough so that it is no longer disqualifying. For example, that hypertension has been controlled. At this point, the examiner can complete any other paperwork and marvel at the efficiency of the federal hiring system. John the Occ Doc, out.